so crazy. But of course, I wasn't gonna try to like.
That would be really
you know,
scary.
bump
Oh my
into
God.
this tiny, like, it's
Yeah.
right. So yeah, so she worked out.
The camera right into the TV.
There and after the loop, to get back and forth.
No, there's no way. There's no way.
Right out.
Yeah,
It was
right
like
out.
10 a.m. I was like,
No.
but he was amazing. And I was able to listen to the whole thing.
Oh, good.
Like, finish.
Oh, good.
And he did not trust. So that's like the team.
Perfect.
The team.
That's-
That's, you have to
You
trust
gotta
your
like
team.
it.
You know?
Well, it was funny because you'll see Gabriella in the room is gonna come and
Oh,
she's gonna
great.
stay with us for lunch. But that was her former office, the
Oh,
room you were in.
very nice.
So it worked out very well. Okay, so we're gonna let a few more students.
Yeah, so I should have found out that I remember I was sitting in Stacy Mann used to live there.
Yeah.
Stacy
Oh, do you know her?
Mann. Yeah.
Okay.
And I was sitting in her office. I don't remember what we were doing. We were doing citizenship work together. And
Oh, you worked on that project. Okay.
yeah, I organized with us to see.
Oh, that.
Yeah. And that's when I found out I passed I think it was the New Jersey bar. I was like sitting upstairs.
Really?
Yeah.
Here? Oh my gosh.
If you guys want to do the QR code, that would be great.
Yeah.
Scan the QR code, everybody.
Mainly so we can all see you on.
So yeah, everybody just complete the QR code right when you come in, that'd be great.
That's my office now,
Oh.
at least one of hers, I don't know.
Or Stacy was, that's right.
Yeah.
that's her office.
I left some of her stuff on the wall. It's much more interesting than anything I have, so.
And she's still associated, she's at Princeton or something?
Yeah.
I think she's a visiting fellow.
At Princeton. And
No,
she's
no,
a visiting associate.
visiting
here.
associate.
Yeah, she's a visiting associate here. They got it.
Yeah.
That's terrific. But I forgot, I don't think I really.
She's here, she came to a couple of visiting.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
which seems like all the time.
Yeah. She was here a couple of times, right before.
Hi, nice to see you. How about maybe our students, maybe those chairs back there, just so you're closer and can be part of the conversation, that would be great.
You want to go right over here?
Yeah. So, let's talk about 20 people in the mental health, but then people are zooming in.
We have a sense of the other campuses.
Not, Jessica will know, I don't know, what
We
other
have definitely
campuses.
Princeton is going to be attending community college, or excuse me, Berkeley College, which is located in the Harvard State area. I'm trying to think, a lot of Rutgers and Harvard folks, but mostly like Princeton, Berkeley, and then UAE, some of them as well.
Is this package?
Like this, right? Okay.
And then I do need to like it out. As long as you don't have a stake behind it, if you want, you can promise you're on the jacket and you're nice.
Okay.
And we're thinking that. Visit here first, you know, opportunity like session, and then we'll be able to see if people who are zooming in have any questions, and they can even, speak, yeah, they can unmute and speak. So Jeff will be in her office, but she and I have been communicating that she's here.
And this is, and so do you want me to do anything in terms of like a Zoom hosting thing? No?
Everything is done
Okay.
on my side, and we have our coordinator Max as well, who's also tuning in case everything's going on.
Oh, I see our
Not
screen
yet.
here.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
that's
that's
very
the
nice.
screen, that's the camera up there.
Okay.
So yeah, and so that's why we're encouraging students to sit like, you might want to sit up close. One of these closer seats, so then you can be on Zoom. Once everyone is done with QR code, Jessica will be able to bring up the results on screen, so you'll be able to see the results.
And I guess
Excellent.
one note, one final note, also just one piece of course, this process.
Like here.
Here or in front of our, moving backwards a little bit.
Got it. Okay. And everything that's up here is here, and the main thing here is just to see the PowerPoint. Okay, perfect.
And Wednesday is the last of the results, it's all laid down, that's certified.
And then the results are going to come in as like graphs, as well, we'll just see how it kind of
We'll just
chugs on
see.
the paragraph.
That's tentative.
Okay.
I only had one respondent. We can meet.
Okay, so hopefully, should we have them all be doing it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Or- So if you haven't, welcome everybody, nice to see everyone. We're gonna give folks a couple more minutes to get in and get settled, and then we'll begin with some opening remarks, and I'll introduce our speaker. As you see, there's a QR code up on the screen. If you haven't done so already, you put your phone up. Professor Bromberg is trying to gather a little bit of data that she'll reflect upon in the conversation. So let us know if you can't access it. I think people have been fairly successful thus far. And we'll give people a few more minutes to get settled.
Hi.
How are you? Yes.
If an old person takes the poll, does
I
that
don't
skew the
think, yeah,
results
do
too much?
you want everyone, do you want just students?
Probably
You probably
students,
just
Just the
right?
students,
I
yeah.
think so, but it's a 94, so don't know.
I was gonna say, yeah.
Unless anybody here is secretly.
I think my numbers went through.
And when I start, I should make sure people, do they already know?
They know, so they'll
Okay.
see it on up there.
Okay, so give it two.
Exactly. When it starts. Let me go straight to picture number 8.
Okay, and I'll have my phone, maybe just give me a nudge when you want me to get going. Hi, welcome. For our Darien students, if you could grab your name tags, so as Robert wants to address you, she'll know your name. It's also a good way for me to keep track of attendance. We'll get started in just a second. Hey, maybe you want to try to okay, that chair at this seat so you can be part of the conversation. I was going to text Nancy Thomas today just to say good luck, but I also don't want to overwhelm.
I know.
With
I
the
can't
chair.
imagine what like that looks like to release that.
Oh, yeah, because, and you can tell, I haven't looked at it yet, but I downloaded the report.
Oh, they literally already published it?
Oh, yeah, the report is out. This is the report, so turnout rates are, so I think 66%. You're welcome. I don't
That's what
know.
they're saying.
This,
for her report.
correct, so, and that's up from 53, I think.
Yeah,
So,
that's,
ah,
this is,
yeah.
it was based on her last number was 53, or 53 was the, like. the
I
number
think it's
that
for
everyone else
NSOL
was
data,
getting.
I think 53 is the
It
NSOL.
was the NSOL.
Yeah.
okay. Wow.
And I should get my report, I mean, each campus should get their report today also.
This is very exciting.
I know.
We should be good to get started.
Yeah. So, hopefully that will be reflected in Rutgers rates also.
I think that's right.
I would hope so. So again, if you haven't, for students who just came in too, there's a QR code up on the screen. If you don't mind accessing the QR code, completing the questions. So I can actually see. So for students who are just coming in and getting settled, if you haven't done so already, if you could grab your phone, access the QR code, and we're going to ask you to complete the survey. And Professor Bromberg wants to be able to gather some data that she'll reflect upon during the talk. So I think Jess has given me the go-ahead to get started. So good morning, everybody. It's a beautiful day here at Woodlawn, so that's a good thing. Sun is out and it's not raining, so that's a plus. So for our in-person audience and for our virtual audience, welcome to Woodlawn, welcome to the drawing room at the Eagleton Institute of Politics, and welcome to this conversation with Professor Yael Bromberg on the 26th Amendment and youth voting and access to the ballot. All of you know, but if there's anyone who doesn't know, my name is Elizabeth Maddow, and I'm the Associate Research Professor here at Eagleton, and I direct our Center for Youth Political Participation, and I'm the instructor for this class, for the Darien Civic Engagement Project. And as I'm kicking things off, I do want to acknowledge and thank Susan and Stephen Darien and the Darien Fund for the U.S. Constitution, Citizenship, and Civic Engagement,
that supports this work. I think Susan and Stephen are going to be zooming in, so I hope they are and can join the conversation. Really happy to be joined by students of the Darien Civic Engagement Project, from students from some other classes are going to be joining us today. So that's exciting, and I'm happy to have everybody here. I think everyone knows this, but it's worth amplifying that 2021 marks the 50th anniversary of the passage of the 26th Amendment. Lowering, yes, Patrick, worth clapping for. Lowering the voting age from 21 to 18, and really with its ratification ushered in, an influx of a significant number of voters, really in expanding the franchise to a huge swath of the American populace. And this Constitution Day, we were thrilled to celebrate Constitution Day by having a conversation, a moderated discussion led by Professor Yael Bromberg about the passage of the 26th Amendment. And she was able to actually engage in a discussion with one of the original young activists, Patricia Kiefer, who was instrumental in the passage of the 26th Amendment, the ratification of the 26th Amendment, and also some contemporary youth activists. And it was a really vibrant conversation, and really highlighted for us not only the impressive, the fact that this was such an impressive moment 50 years ago, but certainly that this is an issue that continues, and ensuring access to the ballot for young adults continues to be of critical importance. So we were thrilled to have Professor Bromberg moderating that discussion then, and very thrilled to have her here today to actually engage in a guest lecture with all of you and those who are zooming in about really fulfilling the promise of the 26th Amendment. So before I hand off to her, I want to give you some background on Professor Bromberg. Yael Bromberg is a constitutional rights attorney and has over 20 years experience working in advocacy, campaigns, and electoral law. And her legal work focuses on electoral law, voting rights, free speech, and civil rights. She is currently a principal of Bromberg Law, of counsel to Weissman and Mintz, and a lecturer at Rutgers Law School at Newark. And I think we do have some budding attorneys in the group, so I'm sure they'll be anxious to hear from you about your work as a scholar and a lecturer. Her scholarship on the 26th Amendment, which I believe you have shared with us today, so thank you so much. Recent scholarship that's been published on the 26th Amendment and fulfilling the promise of the 26th Amendment has been dubbed a groundbreaking study and really a legal call to action. And I think for us, it's a call to action also. Yael formerly served as the chief counsel for voting rights for the Andrew Goodman Foundation, and as supervising attorney and teaching fellow at Georgetown University's Law Center's Civil Rights Clinic and Voting Rights Institute. Most importantly, of course, Professor Bromberg, Yael, is a graduate of Rutgers University. She was a Douglas woman, continues to be a Douglas woman, and attended law school at Rutgers. So I hope that you will find this conversation really fulfilling and enlightening, not only given the work that we do in this classroom, but the work that you have done this semester, getting out the vote. Just want to make a couple notes before I hand off about our format today. Professor Bromberg will start by just sharing some content, some information about her scholarship, about youth voting. Then we really want to open it up to you. It's going to be a student-led discussion with the students here in the room, in the classroom. For if we have people who would like to join the conversation virtually, we'll involve them. So for those who are joining us via Zoom, if you have a question, certainly add it into the chat and we can ask your question. If you'd like to be part of the conversation and unmute yourself, that's fine too. Just raise your virtual hand for the people on Zoom, and we'll be able to engage you in the conversation. After we wrap up, our in-person guests are going to be enjoying pizza on the patio. Take a slice or two on your way to your next class. And for those who are virtual, we'll have to have a slice of pizza for them. So thank you all for joining us. And please join me in welcoming Professor Yael Bromberg.
Everyone doing? Good. It's really exciting for me to be here. As Professor Maddow mentioned, I was a Douglas student. I lived in the dorms not too far from here, and I was literally in your seats about 20 years ago. So it's fun to be here sharing this space with you. I want to just provide you a little bit of, I want to hear about kind of your reflections of your reading, and also the the conversation that we had with Patricia Kiefer and the other two young women organizers from North Carolina and from Native country. And so I'm really interested in hearing kind of your thoughts, especially as we head into the gubernatorial day and also as youth voting rates are skyrocketing. 2018, we already saw that those rates were shooting, and 2020 just hit it out of the park. A report just came out today, actually, by NSOLV, the Institute for Democracy in Higher Education, and it basically is a study of colleges that self-report to Tufts their voting rates and different aspects of kind of voter and youth participation. And in the last presidential election, what they found was that NSOLV is the name of the study, that the NSOLV campuses had a 52% voting rate. And in 2020, that rate was 66%. So we don't really see that type of percentage point increase. That's highly abnormal. And in fact, it's unprecedented. So young people are very much on the rise in terms of electoral participation, but also civics and organizing and social movements. And so what I want to do is kind of provide a little bit of the background just to orient us, and then we'll have a discussion because I'm really interested in hearing from you. And everyone's taken the poll, so later we're going to see the poll results too. Okay. So yeah, it worked. And also this is the thing, right? I always assume everyone knows what the 26th Amendment is. And also I assume that even when we've studied it a little bit, we still know what it is. And what I've learned is that this is kind of an evolving conversation, and it's very rare in constitutional jurisprudence when we talk about amendments that there's this this terrain that's like nobody has really traversed. And so that's actually the awesome project that we all get to be involved in, because we're creating the jurisprudence and we're creating the public education now, like just being in this conversation. So just for a point of reflection before we jump in, what is the 26th Amendment?
Right, that would be the amendment that enfranchises all citizens 18 and older.
Is that right? Anything more to add? Did it provide for, was it only to lower the voting age to 18? Did it offer more than that? Okay. Let me jump to the text of it, which is always fun to look at. So it provides, this is the text, I'm just gonna pop this here for now. The right of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older, thank you, is it Patrick? Yep. Thank you. To vote shall not be denied or abridged, right? Or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of age. So this jumps out to me. I literally can talk about this for like a year. But is there anything here following Patrick's, take that it lowered the voting age to 18? What other pieces here stand out to us?
It protects the voting rights of any age, like not just young people.
Right, so thank you. So there's an age discrimination aspect to this, right? That there shall be no age discrimination in access to the ballot. Has anyone ever heard of that before? Okay. I have a nod and I have some kind of, and what about, is there anything else here that stands out to you? Some of you may not have looked at an amendment before in terms of the text and the language.
You asked me if the right of citizens, like that's what the focus instead of just the age aspect, but then all citizens in that regard. And then obviously incorporating an 18, their right to vote should not be abridged.
Yeah, that's an interesting reflection that it's focused on citizens, not necessarily focused on non-citizens. Maybe we can read that into the amendment nonetheless. But that is right. And actually, the other amendments are the same way, but those amendments still extend as well, like the 14th Amendment. And what about this second clause? Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. This is actually the vehicle that the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Acts and the other major kind of landscape shifting congressional actions were premised on through the 14th Amendment and 15th Amendment that similarly had the second clause. That there was a enacting clause, there was an enforcement clause by Congress. Hey, we're going to extend this right. And also, by the way, Congress, you be the watchdog so that we can make sure that if we need statutory action, it's not just about going to the judiciary to protect the constitutional right itself. Okay, this is just very quick background, right? Young people were always leading the struggle for expansion of rights and expansion of the franchise at huge personal cost to themselves. And one, we see that this was the assassination of 3 young men in their very early 20s who participated in Freedom Summer in 1964, and they were killed by the Klan on June 21, 1964, in Mississippi. They went missing because they were focused on registering African Americans to vote during a targeted campaign where thousands of young people traveled south to work with young people and African Americans in the South. And Andy and Mickey were 2 young Jews from New York, actually, who joined James, who was from Mississippi, who was welcoming them into the effort. 3 weeks after their assassination, the long languishing Civil Rights Act was finally passed. A year later, John Lewis, the late great congressman, you see him right here, led the march against the Edmund Pettus Bridge. At the time, he was the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee. Later became the congressman that you probably all heard about because he recently passed away, unfortunately. He led this march, right, which captured national attention in large part due to television and violence. And a month later, less than 3 weeks later, the long languishing Voting Rights Act was finally introduced and got a chance in Congress. So young people were always a part of this, and this is nothing new. Alexander Hamilton, Frederick Douglass, Alice Paul, they were in their early 20s when they were shaping the story of America. And Frederick Douglass, he was 23 when he took the stage at the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. Alice Paul, similar early 20s when she participated in the suffrage movement. And of course, Alexander Hamilton you have on the left. And we know that because we see it today, that young people are still moving and shaping our public discourse and our electoral landscape. And finally, at the end of the 60s, they looked to enfranchise themselves. Right, there was a lot of stuff happening. I don't want to relive the 60s during this conversation, but what we see here is that there was a range of partnerships and coalitions that came together to recognize not just that young people should be expanded and participating in the franchise because, you know, it's the right thing to do, et cetera, but they actually believed that young people were critical for the practice of a healthy democracy, and that was really a motivating aspect. And additionally, young people were sacrificing themselves in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. They were increasingly taking on debt. They were increasingly leading their households. It was a very different landscape at the time, largely due to the manner in which K through 12 education had been standardized, and largely due to the fact of evolving technology, that everyone had a television set now. They had access to politics. And when we think about that today, right, we're all tuned in. And at the time, they said, Margaret Mead, famous anthropologist, she said, young people are the most plugged in of any generation at that time because of you're looking to understand and either study and or criticize and make better what you see around you. And that's why ratification came in, again, unprecedented. Huge bipartisan, cross-partisan support. It passed the Senate unanimously. It's really hard to imagine that today, but that's true. And it was because of the cross-partisan support for this amendment. President Nixon was the one that signed it into law. President Eisenhower, also a Republican, included it within his 1954 State of the Union. He had been the commander during World War II. Everyone paid attention to what he had to say. And I can give you more and more examples. And so when we think about the 26th Amendment, what I want us to consider in our conversation is that this is not just a standalone right, that it is a part of the evolution of the right to vote, and it sits within the nation's various reconstructions. And we're actually hosting, I'm happy to be a faculty advisor for a symposium in the spring at the law school, which you're all invited to, in Newark. And, you know, I do wonder whether we are in the midst, and in retrospect, we'll think about it and we'll understand whether we are in the midst of a third reconstruction today. Because what we find is that when new demographics of people participate in the ballot and participate in civics, and when there's violence that's met in response to them, we see states moving to suppress access to the ballot and electoral participation. And all of that played out during the first Reconstruction and the second Reconstruction. And so the question remains, like, are we in the midst of the third Reconstruction? And who are we as actors within it? And here's the other point I want you to take away from this slide, is that the ushering through of new amendments and constitutional rights that are complementary to these Reconstruction movements. Okay, so this is what I want us to really focus our conversation on. The Senate report that was sent through the Senate and through the House, and then through the requisite 38 states to ratify this audacious amendment, included this specific language within it, okay? So can I get a volunteer to read this? I don't see your name, but Ethan.
Forcing young voters to undertake special burdens, obtaining absentee ballots or traveling to one centralized location in each city, for example, in order to exercise their right to vote might well serve to dissuade them from participating in the election.
Okay, special burdens, right? What else do we see here in this text? We're provided specific examples of what they look like, right? Obtaining absentee ballots, meaning if a college is, or not a college, but a county registrar is specifically scheduling elections when the students are away from town, like a spring break or, you know, something of that nature, or traveling to one centralized location in each city. What does that mean?
If there's only one place for you to go, it's so it's very hard to get there.
Yeah. And so if there's not an on-campus polling location, right? And these are just some examples. May well serve, in order to exercise their right to vote, might well serve to dissuade them from participating in the election. So the focus here is, right, when we looked at the text of the 26th Amendment, it said, shall not deny or abridge. And now we're talking about proactive electoral participation. That's interesting. And then the rest of this paragraph talks about how this also abridges the 14th Amendment and the purpose of the Voting Rights Act. Okay, so what are the special burdens? When we look at this language, forcing young people to undertake special burdens, this is I'd like to hear from you. What do you think a special burden is in terms of your own special burdens that you've encountered accessing the ballot, or your peers? And I'll give you a little bit of context for this question. When I was developing this legal scholarship that you have in front of you, academics often get the chance to workshop. So that means we all get together and we hear from our peers. And in my case, I met with constitutional scholars and litigators and other legal scholars in general. And they were older, right? They had college-age young people, children, often, not always, of course. And they said, oh yeah, my kid had an issue. There was a voter registration form that was rejected and they showed up in the polling place and they weren't on the rolls. Or they didn't know where to vote, or this happened, or that happened, etc. And they said, you know what? I didn't think about that in terms of this 26th Amendment. That's the most recent voting rights amendment to be ratified. Right? It's still in our it's still in our nation's conscience, this amendment. The judges today, the lawyers, et cetera, they fought for this amendment because they were in the streets protesting for it. And even they did not think about these special burdens within a constitutional lens of a specific protected class, even when it happened to their kids. So special burdens. Okay, so Isabella says not having a method to get to the polling place because lack of a car or access to public transportation. Is that right? Yep. Okay.
I think just like the whole registration process, like filling out the form, that sort of thing. I think in New Jersey, it's maybe a little bit more accessible, but I know in some states, it can be really confusing.
Okay, and Ethan?
Yeah.
Ethan. What aspect of it? I'm not challenging you, I'm inquiring. What aspect of the voter registration form might be confusing for young people?
I think, I mean, not so much confusing, it just like takes time. I feel like young people, you know, you give them a form to fill out and it's more than like a few pages. It's a little intimidating. Not just young people, just like people in general, you know, everyone's busy, everyone has stuff to do.
And maybe there's information burdens that young people have to overcome because they're new first-time voters, right? The first time you do anything, it's scary and you don't want to mess it up. It's an official document. Maybe you need a little extra help, just guiding you how to fill out the form properly, how to interpret the, you know, how long does this take, you know, basic kind of. Anything else?
I think just not having the day off on election day is a big thing, because if you have a few classes that day, the idea of having to not only travel to one location, but potentially wait a long time would definitely be something that's, and when you wait in your head, not worth it.
And Priya?
Yes.
Okay, and why do you think that that is specifically hard for young people?
I think just, I mean, people are busy and, you know, it can be difficult to kind of want to get to a place when you have so many things going on. I feel like it would be just another burden to your average day, which I feel like could be too much.
Okay, so young people, at least the ones that are students or even non-students, they have busy schedules, they're working, they have class schedules, they live on campus. Maybe there's hard obstacles to overcome for access to transportation, which adds more time and makes it more difficult and complicated for them to actually go and vote and participate on election day. Jake?
Yeah, I think like also like confusion about which like address to go to if you're like out of state and you go to Rutgers, say you're from like New York, you don't really know, like you can't really go home without the access to go home to, kind of adding onto that burden of like which address do I put and how do I access my ballot?
Right, what address do you put? And what does that mean when we're filling out the form? Right, the form says what? Provide us your mailing address. Provide us your residential address.
Yeah.
What does that mean? And why does that specifically impact young people?
Because young people are also like, they may be on on-campus dorms or off-campus housing, but they also their driver's license may be very well registered to like their house where they live with their parents.
Yes, thank you.
I was gonna say, if there was only like one type of polling location, the lines at the polls would be so long, and like knowing how condensed our schedules can be at times, like you might not have the time and access to vote.
Right, long lines at the polling location. If I recall, one of the young women that participated in our conversation, she said, you know, I went to go and vote early because I anticipated problems and I had to travel. I think she said she had to take 2 buses, et cetera, and walk. And then I get there and there's this long line. So why absent election day voting, how are we supposed to navigate that process? And when I say we, I'm including because I'm the last age of the millennial generation. So I wrote myself in with you all.
The ID requirements, so young people might not have access to IDs that older young voters are 18. So if you're an 18-year-old high school student, I don't think every high school even puts out like high school ID data. So yeah, a lot.
So let's tease that out a little bit. What's your name? Ole. Oh, hi, Ole. Former student. I don't recognize you with the mask on. So tease that out a little bit. for the voter ID for young people, they don't necessarily have even high school IDs. And I think Jake talked about earlier for out-of-state students that their out-of-state driver license might not be accepted in the new state. Okay,
Kind of going off of what Jake was saying earlier, with like the residential address and the mailing address. Like my mailing address has changed every single year after school. I'm not gonna sit and re-register every single year. It's hard, like when it's already complicated to do it, once, not to do it again and again and again. Trying to figure out how to do it. It's becomes more of a hassle than anything.
yeah,
It's a thing.
Roni, right?
Ron.
Ronnie, okay, yes. High, extraordinarily high turnover rate for young people when they have to move. How many, I'm just gonna call it you. How many times have you moved? Say, do you have the same current residence than you did during the presidential election last November? No. How many times have you moved since then?
I'm from out of state, so I like, was in Florida for a while, but I lived on campus freshman year and then my sophomore and my junior year, 2 separate campus locations. So I've had 4 in the last 4 years.
Okay, and then what about the summers?
It goes back and forth, sometimes in here, sometimes in home.
Okay, at one address at home?
Yeah. There are
Okay,
2 addresses.
at 2 addresses.
My parents.
So now we're talking about, yeah, but it's a whole thing for everyone. And so what you just said, Roni, is that you have 6 addresses in 4 years, which is the span of a presidential cycle. Okay, let's move on. Ole,
I just saw one more. Vote by mail, like 3-week, 4-week deadlines. So like, you can submit for vote by mail, maybe day out, as long as it's submitted on the those deadlines are so far out, very burdensome. It's kind of doing this, for me, and so some states that have to say.
right, so for the folks on Zoom, so Ole is describing advanced deadlines associated with vote by mail, even voter registration, right? And various aspects for participating. So I hope somebody's taking notes and you can send them to me. So these are the special burdens that I've kind of identified through my work. Some of these are, we mentioned, and I know that we have a student conversation that's kind of slated for now, but you guys all really participated in this here. So I'm gonna walk you through this a bit and try to reserve some time for the folks on Zoom if they're interested in having a student conversation, then we can also have one internally too. So residency and voter registration. There are various states which actively tell young people that you can't register to vote from your college address, or that you need to particularly prove your, let's say, allegiance or affiliation to the state in order to register to vote, and threaten prosecution if you participate, right? I'm not making this up. New Hampshire is a constant example of this. Okay? Multiple state and federal litigation efforts have resulted. What they put into law has always looked a little different. Once it gets shot down, it gets reintroduced, but kind of shaped up a little bit. But ultimately, you know, one of their efforts was you have to prove that you are a valid resident of the state by getting a in-state vehicle registration card. Imagine being an out-of-state student, navigating everything. I mean, I don't even have to tell you guys. And especially during COVID, this was like an emerging issue, right? Where do you vote from, et cetera, et cetera. Just in the interest of, I mean, I literally can talk about each one for a class. So going to voter identification. In Tennessee, a faculty member can vote using their institution's issued identification card, but a student cannot vote using their institution issued identification card. We get a lot of like confused eyebrows and wrinkled noses, but that's true. And actually a federal court judge upheld that, I think erroneously, but you know, we take our obstacles as we get them. In Texas, you can vote using a handgun license, but not a student identification card issued by the state. North Carolina also had issues that was shut down through litigation. Wisconsin is in active litigation. There you can use a student identification card, but it must have been issued within the last 2 years. Otherwise, it's considered expired, even though it's completely valid for every other purpose that a student identification card is actually valid for. That was with regard to access to the ballot, but not access to your cafeteria or your dorm. And in Wisconsin is actually interesting because 300,000 students across the state. The electoral margin in 2016 in Wisconsin, anyone remember? 23,000. So 300,000 young people across the state are obstructed in using their student identification cards. And they're not necessarily always told, oh, hey, you're a voter, you can't use your student ID for this election, right? And a 23,000 vote margin. Let's talk about electoral impact. I have this great report that I principally authored when I was working at Common Cause called Tuning In and Tuning Out. There's maps there that talk about the impact of student ID, specifically student ID and out-of-state ID, and kind of overlay them. Access to polling places, litigation that I've been involved in and is now over, brought by the League of Women Voters of Florida and the Andrew Goodman Foundation against the state. There, the state had an outright ban on placing polling places on campuses during the early voting period. I'm getting wrinkled eyebrows and confused looks. Yeah, I'm not making there's a outright ban. And a college student recognized this and wrote an op-ed that got placed, which got the attention of constitutional litigators and national and statewide organizations and local organizations. And they filed suit under the 26th Amendment and they overturned this ban. And then I was at the Andrew Goodman Foundation. We went back after we won and we studied the impact of the overturn of the ban. Because we went from a situation where we had zero participation of not just young people, but in general, voting on campuses to now we kind of opened the door. So let's study the impact. When the judge issued his decision in August 2018, the November election was basically like 3 months away. So in 3 months, the county registrars of the colleges could work together to bring a polling place on campus. Within those 3 months, 12 on-campus polling locations were secured. 60,000 people participated in them. We're talking about young people. We're also talking about like young affiliated people, like maybe like faculty members and staff, et cetera. That election margin in the Senate, let me pull up my notes because I hate using the wrong numbers. It's like my pet peeve. Just in terms of the electoral margin. So the electoral margin, so we're talking about 60,000 new voters, right? The electoral margin in 2018 for the Senate was 10,000 votes. And for the gubernatorial was 32,000 votes. Okay. So we're talking about a specific electoral impact of a discrete and protected group of voters. And I'm trying to go through this pretty quickly. I have a new report that I'm working on. I'm hoping to publish it for the next symposium that I mentioned in the spring. Oh, I had an oral argument this morning upstairs in the New York State Appellate Division. There, in there you have, in New York, you have a board of elections comprised of 2 commissioners, 1 R and 1 D, and they work together to assign all of the polling places on campuses. In New Jersey, we have the county registrars. I understand that your county registrar is coming to you soon. So in New York, Bard College, I'm actually representing Bard College and the university president and a slew of students and a student-led organization. They're pushing for an on-campus polling location. 70% of the residents in that county are coming from the Bard College, but they're being sent off campus to vote. We won the on-campus polling location for the first time in Bard's history in 2020. And the county is up to the same issue. And so we're pushing it now for the 2021 election for Tuesday. I have more and more to talk about this. Campus gerrymandering, this is a really great resource, this IDH Campus Boundaries Project. I want everyone to look at this because you can go to it, it's like fun and also like brilliant. You can go to it and you can plug in a college, any college in the country. And then on the bottom left of the grid, you can plug in the congressional and state and local district lines through the redistricting process. And you can see whether or not that base of voters has been cut up and diluted based on who will ultimately represent them for the next election term. So put in Rutgers there, see what it looks like. I know folks here are also on Zoom are also calling from Princeton and Berkeley. Let me tell you, put in Montclair and see what comes up, okay? And this is the other thing I want to talk about with regards to the special burdens is, and when we switch the conversation, I want to talk about what you all can do, what we can do, what your peers can do, is, there's a currently active process taking place for redistricting in the states across the country. And young people can advocate, and they are advocating to make sure that their college areas are considered communities of interest and protected groups, et cetera, et cetera. And they're submitting that to the legislature or the commissioners or whoever's in charge of these efforts. And they're creating a legislative record. It doesn't just sit in the abyss. Now you're creating a record, a public document that can be referred to. And so people can start to understand, oh, what is that 26th Amendment? I don't even know what it is. I don't even know what it means when it applies to my kid. No, now you're actively participating in the dialogue. Okay, I'm trying to get through this as quickly as possible. Provisional ballots. 1 in 4 millennials had to fill out a provisional ballot in 2016. Who had to fill out a provisional ballot of the boomers? Only 6%, and greatest generation, 3%. And we assume that the provisional ballots, everyone should vote provisionally if you're required to, right? Like if you have to vote because you create a paper trail, but we have to study the way that these provisional ballots are treated. Not only are young people overly relying on them, but their specific provisional ballots are rejected at a disproportionate rate. Vote by mail, we have 7 states in the country. I participated in some litigation this last term out of various states that went up for cert to the Supreme Court twice. Access to no excuse to vote by mail. Who can use that in these 7 states? Only voters who are 60 or 65 plus, even during the pandemic. So what COVID has taught us is that we can modernize our elections, that we know how to do this, that we could expand online voter registration and election day registration. By the way, New Jersey does not have election day registration, that young people specifically need election day registration, also known as same day registration, especially when we're looking at the early voting period, which New Jersey now has. And COVID has taught us what election modernization looks like. And so that should be the new normal, especially when we see young people participating at these crazy rates. And this map is very interesting. It shows the state by state turnout from 2020. New Jersey is the highest in the country at 67%, which is really remarkable. Even with Wisconsin and Oregon that have uniform vote by mail, they're 59 and 58%, still significant. Many states are still hovering. Look, Texas is at 41% youth electoral participation. The interesting thing that I find about this map is that when we study the provisions included in HR 1 and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the current Voting Rights Act bills that are trying to be introduced finally, and they need to be in Congress, where 4 of those measures are in place on a state level through state legislative action, we see outsized booms to youth voting rates like New Jersey. Okay, and this is not a partisan issue. North Carolina, or I'll give you an example. Texas, 41%, but Texas has early voting. So early voting is not partisan, right? And I think that that's something else that COVID has taught us, that these election modernization is not partisan. Okay, so I'll be quiet now, and I'm really interested in hearing from you all. And maybe we should allow for the conversations to take place on Zoom too, separately among the group.
The number of questions.
Chat too.
Okay,
So.
thank you, Jessica. Yeah, let's go to the poll also.
So Jess, I think we want to look at the poll results.
Okay.
I don't know how well people can see the poll results, but I think we have students from in the room and outside the room answering some of the questions that Professor Robert posed.
Okay, so for example, let's look at question 6. Is your current residence in 2021 different than your residence from the June primary, from the summer? Right? Same electoral cycle, summer to fall. Okay, so I'm seeing 9 yeses. I'm gonna like ballpark this, unless Jessica, you're. Okay, so let's ballpark it. It looks like approximately 9 yeses out of maybe more or less a dozen. Here, 9 yeses. Out of more or less a dozen participants. 8 no's. Oh, that's interesting. That's really interesting. So half, a little over half, have a different residence from June. And then residences that you lived in during the 2021 calendar year, how many different residences? We're seeing a lot of 2s, 3 or more. Okay, I would say, Jessica, can we count just the 1s? Four 1s. Out of about 20 participants. Eight have moved twice. So going back to this conversation about special burdens, I think even just taking this like very simple poll among ourselves, 3 moved more than 3 times. We can see what these special burdens look like specifically. Oh, let's look at whether or not your college has an on-campus polling location as the last review of the poll. This is going to be skewed because most of the people here are at Rutgers. We have 1, I don't know. Thank you for being honest. Oh, Virginia State University, great. I did a survey. We have a lot of yeses, but I'm going to tell you right now that's totally skewed. Not just because it's just this is where because we're at Rutgers basically is what we're seeing there. And by the way, if you look specifically at the Rutgers campus, not everyone can vote on campus. Some voters can, right? Like if it is like when I was in school, you could go and vote at the on College Ave at the main campus building, but the Douglas and Cook, we were all sent everywhere else, right?
And Brunswick. There's one in the Bush Campus Center, one in the Livingston Campus Center. And
Okay,
those are the
good.
only ones in university facilities.
Okay,
So they're near College Ave, but not on College.
right. I remember when I was living off campus on College Ave, off of College Ave, I couldn't vote in that on-campus location. I had to vote in another location. And when I was living on Douglas, I had to travel somewhere up Commercial Ave, if I remember, to vote, and somewhere I would never have otherwise gone. So there you have it. I have a polling place report that I'm doing nationally that did a survey of on-campus polling locations. And what I found, actually, the results were like shocking. 50% of the campuses I looked at had an on-campus polling location on election day. So only 50% on election day, and roughly the same, more or less, during the early voting period when early voting was available within the state. So, you know, this is what it looks like. So how do we start to fulfill the promise? I want to do a quick time check here. I think we have until 12:10, so we have a decent amount of time. I really want to hear your reflections, either from this conversation and or from, you know, the prior conversation with Patricia Kiefer and the young women from across the country. Like, what do you think of all of this?
I have a question for you, actually. So a lot of people that I've talked to, like more adults, a lot of their reasonings for why they think that younger people should be allowed to vote is because like the young people have experienced the real world. Like, what would you say to them?
Okay, what would somebody else say to that? Have you experienced the real world?
I really think it's a matter of like having experienced the real world. I think it's more like, are there issues out there that affect you, and do you deserve to have a say in those issues? Like, I mean, first thing I can think of is climate change. Like, young people are going to be impacted more by climate change than older people. Yet, you know, you have to be 18 to vote. Like, I feel like it should be like 16 now, because climate change is such like a pertinent issue, and young people are going to be directly impacted by it.
Other thoughts? I mean, climate change is a great example because you're basically inheriting the future.
I think there are a lot of young people who have experienced more of like the real world than a lot of adults. Like, there are people who like are in high school and still have to like provide for their families, or like see like insane amounts of violence on a daily basis, and it's like that is more like jarring and like realistic stuff than like someone who's just gone their whole life having to path through like a privileged lifestyle.
So maybe we have more, this generation is experiencing more violence compared to prior generations. Do you have more thoughts about what that might look like?
Just about like students who live in inner cities, or students who just like, I don't know, go to school and are live in fear of shootings and things like that, like that weren't happening as much for our parents' generations and like the generation before that.
Thank you. Yeah, the gun control movement, Parkland, Columbine. I mean, COVID, I think, was the only time that there was no gun shooting, mass gun shooting that took place at schools or otherwise, right? So we have an increasingly violent society.
In fact, that's not what the whole real world thing is. It's to say that we don't live in the real world right now because of how fast the world is moving. And then, like, not to generalize, but then the old population who kind of has slowly quickly moving away from society used to be how it should be, but that's not the real world anymore. So who says we're not in the real world, and they are? Only many times it's the opposite. So I feel like that's just
So changing norms, I think maybe we can specifically see that around technology. Technology is extraordinarily different every generation, which might implicate privacy rights and access and all other questions. Okay, so we hit on a lot of them. About women's rights, the right to personal autonomy of your bodies. Others?
From a financial standpoint, especially if you're like 18 plus and you be on your own, having to provide for yourself, because that's going off someone else's point as well. But I think a big thing was like during COVID when everyone got like stimulus checks and like I believe like our age group like did not. And I think that's like a really good like point that like I think like our parents also were getting plus money if like they had children as well. But like from an economic regard, we don't have legislators that like represent us or representing like our concerns and like our rights in that regard. And those are obviously the people that we put into office and like our concerns are just gonna be swept by.
Right. Which is all the more reason why we have to make sure that the votes matter and they're being cast and counted. Okay, see Isabella.
Also, college has never been more expensive than it is right now. So if you're a student whose parents aren't well off, you have to find new jobs to pay for college. And like, student debt is a big problem that we all face or a concern that we all face every day. I know I do. So that is something that is proportionally affected nowadays.
Jake, I think I saw your hands
Yeah,
up.
just maybe not go off for a bit about like general like public awareness too about the election and people not really, I guess, like quote unquote caring about like local assemblymen, assemblywomen, state senators, like legislatures in the state, where people are really focused on like the presidential election and like when I've like tabled like get to vote initiatives here, like a lot of people didn't know there was like a gubernatorial election for Governor Murphy this year. So I think that also like young people, like as we've seen, like technology and social media can really heighten like awareness for that. Like Instagram, Facebook have those little blurbs where you can sign up to vote here, and you can also like register to vote. And there's a lot of campaign initiatives there. I think that that's helping in part, but also like there should be more of that done at like the state level, local level too.
So when we're talking about fulfilling the promise, it's how do we leverage technology, right, to ensure voter awareness and participation and make sure that we elect legislators that listen to the voices and issues of a specific protected class of people. Patrick.
Just a reminder to speak up too, so people can hear us Zoom.
Got it.
Thank you.
Something I'm curious about is that you were discussing a lot of different voting issues from the enfranchisement of women to the enfranchisement of African American people to the enfranchisement of youth vote. And I'm curious how you see these movements as related, as connected to each other in the sense that unlike the enfranchisement based on sex or race, people grow older, people grow out of the youth vote. So I'm curious if you think that changes the dynamics of how we should see solutions to.
Yeah, I mean, Patrick, I have a huge smile under my mask right now because I do actually. This gives me like a huge amount of optimism and hope. Is that, and I talk about this in my article, is that age. In constitutional law, there's specific types of what's protected, like suspect classifications, right? And so a suspect classification is something that doesn't change over time. And also that's immutable, that you have no control over, right? And I say this with a grain of salt because we have certain norms that are shifting in what we have traditionally considered suspect classifications, like gender, right? Is a specific area around that. But other than that, like you can't change your race, you can't change your national origin, you can't change your foreign relationship to the country, meaning, my parents are from Russia and Lithuania, like that's never gonna change for them, right? That has to do with national origin, but it also has to do with how they relate to like what the American system looks like in a different way. But age is different because you always have this particular class that's baked in, but the individuals within that class change over time. And so that's where I see a lot of hope, because older people remember what it was like to be young. And older Republicans and Democrats don't want their kids' ballot to be tossed for no reason. So I see age as, especially when we're talking about voting rights, which is so polarized in like our current setting, as a way to bring us together around what access to the ballot and election modernization should look like. Because it's both something that you don't have control over changing, right? Like God willing you age, right? But the group itself remains to some degree stagnant. The group itself, there will always be a base of young people in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Always. You might move, but do you know where you're going to move after you? That's a whole other thing, right? You might move, but there will always be that base. And the concerns are largely always going to be the same for the base of young people in New Brunswick, New Jersey, or around any other college jurisdiction.
So if we're talking about being able to measure whether or not there's discrimination to access to the ballot, are we looking at the intent of the state legislators or the boards of election? Or are we looking at effect, the outcomes of these pieces of legislation? How do we know when it's purposeful, or how do we know it's discriminatory access to the ballot?
So thank you, Professor Matto, because this is very much a live conversation. And in the election law class that we had, we studied how this is a live conversation, not just for young people, but in terms of voting rights in general right now. Specifically with like the Bromberg Supreme Court case that was handed down during the last day of the last term, Supreme Court term, but just in general. So this is very much a live conversation, and there's certain standards of review that a judge will apply where there's a voting rights obstacle or just civil rights obstacle that the judge has to look at. And so the question becomes how, as a plaintiff's lawyer and how as a plaintiffs, by the way, I represented the Rutgers University Student Association in a really fun case I could tell you about. So the question is, how do we engage and create a record to show both intentional and effects-based discrimination? And intentional discrimination doesn't always have to be shown. And effects-based discrimination does not always have to be shown. So this is a very simple way to respond to a very complicated question. But there are different standards of reviews that are applied. And because in the 26th Amendment context, this is a very, very new and nascent jurisprudence. So in my article, for those that want to read it, you'll find that in the 70s, immediately after ratification, there was a huge amount of litigation in state courts and in federal courts across the country, including one case that was summarily affirmed by the United States Supreme Court related to the 26th Amendment, right? Related to this like crazy, huge, drastic expansion of the franchise for new voters. And then in the 80s and the 90s and the early 20s, there was nothing. There was no 26th Amendment litigation. And so this is a really big part of why people don't even know what this amendment is. I mean, the way that I developed this was because I was teaching at Georgetown Law and I was teaching voting rights. And when I looked at the case book and the like standard materials that you like rely on and the cases in this area of voting rights and democracy, there's literally nothing around the 26th Amendment. And because I was a student organizer, I had experienced and known that me and my peers had problems. And here was this amendment that no one was talking about. So the question about how the courts should treat 26th Amendment causes of action and challenges is still being developed. And by the way, it's not being developed necessarily in the right way because it's something new. This is still something that we have to educate the public about and ourselves about to understand what the right is, to normalize the fact that there's a suspect group that's protected by this amendment. And then that actually does start to shape the discourse and the way that the judiciary and the decision makers consider these challenges. And I'll give you an example, and I don't want to get too kind of bogged down in the details of it. In the Florida litigation that I described earlier about the outright ban of putting polling places on campuses during the early voting period, that was an obvious case of intentional discrimination. So the judge looked at it and he said, like, get out of here with this. This is clear, right? But in North Carolina, where there was an omnibus voting rights law that was introduced right after the Shelby 2013 Supreme Court decision came down, the state basically said, oh, we don't have to ask the judge, the Department of Justice, for pre-clearance before we implement new laws. Okay, we're just gonna do it. It's a whole other conversation. We're just gonna do it. So the Supreme Court came down, the state read it as, oh, we have permission to just expand this voter law, and they implemented upwards of 23 new voting changes in one bill, more or less overnight. And one of the provisions there was a cut to a very successful high school pre-registration program that in 3 years had registered 160,000 high schoolers in the state. Okay, that seems like an obvious attack at the youth vote, but that wasn't litigated as such. And actually the youth vote wasn't a part of that conversation. It was focused, for good reason, on attacks on intentional discriminatory attacks on the Black vote, for good reason. But that voice, that perspective, that protected class didn't end up being a part of the litigation. In the recent round of litigation in 2020 around COVID, those 7 states that I described that you can only avail yourself to no excuse vote by mail if you're 60 or 65 plus. Right? Let me say that again. So in 7 states in the country, if you're 60 or 65 older, so if you're over a certain age threshold, you don't have to provide any excuse in order to vote by mail. And in many of those states, if you were a young person that wanted to vote by mail, COVID didn't count as an excuse, right? You had to appear in person to vote. But those 60 or 65 plus could just vote by mail and not even say, oh, it's because of COVID or, da-da. So if you're 55 years old and immunocompromised, you can't avail yourself of that. And if you're 18, you can't avail yourself of that. And so this conversation about what the jurisprudence and the standard of review should be applied actually became really complicated. And there was some terrible decision-making that was made because also there was exigent circumstances and emergency, et cetera, and it's a new area of law. And you would think that it would be obvious because you have a clear age cutoff. And so that's obviously the state denying or abridging access to the franchise on account of age, right? If you're 55, you also can't prevail yourself with that. And what the Fifth Circuit decided, the Fifth Circuit reversed a Texas federal court decision. And that decision was so bad that the Fifth Circuit had to reverse, another Fifth Circuit panel had to reverse the first panel, which erroneously cited my scholarship for the proposition that it just supports the idea that the 26th Amendment was only to lower the age to 18. And another case was being brought up by Indiana, and both of these that was affirmed by the Seventh Circuit. And the Supreme Court denied review of both of those federal appeals court decisions out of the Fifth Circuit and the Seventh Circuit, originally arising out of Texas and Indiana. And if you look at what those decisions say about the jurisprudence of the 26th Amendment, it's really shocking. What they say is that it's not an abridgment of the right to vote that you can't avail yourself of vote by mail because you never had that right. Because in 1971, when the 26th Amendment was ratified, vote by mail was not a thing. That's where we are with the voting rights jurisprudence. So they're saying there's no abridgment. But remember the paragraph that we looked at about forcing young people to undertake special burdens may very well dissuade them from political participation. It's talking about political expansion, not just abridgment and not just denial, right? So I'm not advocating that the 26th Amendment protects political expansion. But I'm saying that's how we should take that information to understand where we identify abridgments of the right.
So we have about 10 more minutes, and I don't think there are any questions yet, but if any questions come in via Zoom, please feel free to send them. Does anyone else have any other questions of Professor Bromberg? And maybe we could also talk about what do we do?
Okay, yeah.
What
I'll
should we do,
offer-
but I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm just curious, what do you think about lowering the voting age to 16?
So it's a very good question, and there's a lot of really interesting comparative law when you compare what happens in other states and other countries with regard to lowering the voting age. I think it's an interesting proposition, and that a lot of municipalities have started to enact local laws to expand access to 16, including like Bethesda in Maryland, probably in California. I did a report on this that I never published, but it was an analysis of the municipalities and the language of those laws. And we have to, my opinion is that let's see how it plays out and let's expand those and analyze how that works. My focus is we can't even protect the right for 18 to 24-year-olds. And so, the expansion of the right to 16 is really interesting. And I think it's very persuasive, especially when we think about Parkland and Columbine and the high school massacres that are taking place and climate change. But that's kind of where I land on it. And I think it's the expansion of the 16 vote needs to be a part of the discussion. Nelson Mandela was in support of it, by the way. There's been a lot of interesting folks that have come out that said this is actually a human rights issue. But for me, my focus, I've tried to focus on the 26th Amendment 18-year-old piece because it's an unexplored area and it's something that we have yet to really find a fix to. The other thing I'll say really quickly is that this question about on-campus polling places, my experience litigating this case at a bar now for about 3 years has shown me, and this is what I'm going to include in my next piece of legal scholarship, that this question about access to the ballot for on-campus voting is actually not only about young people, it is, but on-campus sites tend to be much more ADA compliant than off-campus sites due to various federal regulations that mandate the receipt of public funds for colleges to operate. So they tend to be much more accessible for differently abled populations. And they tend to be much more accessible for racial groups, protected racial groups, because colleges tend to be diverse. Maybe not as diverse as we'd like them to be, et cetera. But compared to the populations that they sit in, the larger populations, especially when we're looking at HBCUs or minority serving institutions or public colleges, they tend to be more diverse. So I see expansion of the youth vote, especially with this aspect of on-campus polling locations, as something that, this is maybe the title of my next piece, is going to be about intertwining rights with the disability justice community and the racial justice community.
Before I just want to give one opportunity. If there are any students who are on Zoom, I think there might be some students on Zoom, and I'm not sure, Jess, if they have a question, wanted to ask you to, I wanted to at least give those students an opportunity. If not, we certainly have some here, but if there are any students who are coming in via Zoom, if they wanted to ask a question, they're welcome to unmute and we can find them on here. No, Jess? Okay, we'll go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead, Jeffrey.
I'm just kind of curious, in your view, what would be, in an ideal world, what would be the voting experience for an 18 to 22-year-old?
I'm going to kick it back to you guys.
I mean, this most recent election cycle, the ballot being mailed to me, I literally filled it on my kitchen counter and put it back in the mailbox, and that was it. I mean, I think that would really be the best way to do it, but I know that there was a lot of issues that I had to keep checking to make sure that my vote was sent through, was accounted for. But I think this most recent cycle was kind of close to ideal.
So pre-op, right? So universal automatic sending of vote by mail ballots with an option for tracking those ballots. And not only tracking them in the mail, but also tracking whether or not they were counted, right? Did you know that when you vote provisionally, Do you ever hear from the government about whether or not your ballot was actually counted? Or why it might have been rejected? Isn't that crazy? If you order something from Amazon, you can track it, but you can't track your vote, which is a fundamental right.
No, I was just gonna say another one, is switch to digital for online voting or not online voting, online automatic notices.
Mhm.
With a votes coming out.
Right, like a push notification. Yeah,
Text.
here's your voter information, here's how your ballot managed, da, da, da. Have any questions, right? That you can also, so evolving technology changes our standard of what we expect in terms of access to the vote. But you're not gonna see constitutional jurisprudence around that, right? The courts will never accept that, at least not right now. I tried, I brought that case in New Jersey on behalf of RUSA. I said, we have evolving technology for, let me tell you something about New Jersey. If you cast a provisional ballot in New Jersey and you prove that you are who you say you are and you live where you say you are while you're casting that ballot, but you're not on the rolls because maybe your voter registration form got lost by a third-party group that registered you to vote, or it got lost in the mail, or there was an error at the clerk's office, et cetera, you made a good faith effort to attempt to register to vote, and you're not on the rolls on election day, you go and you vote provisionally, right? In New Jersey, that provisional ballot, if filled out correctly with the help of the poll workers, will count as a voter registration for future elections. But will it be counted for the specific election that you're voting in? No. This is a quirk of New Jersey law. It was the basis of the constitutional case that I brought on behalf of RUSA, that I built on behalf of RUSA while at the Rutgers Constitutional Litigation Clinic at the law school. And I wrote an article about this with Frank Askin, because what we did was we looked at the 2008 election and looked at the impact of that. And this will be really interesting for you as you head into the gubernatorial and you look at the election margin that results from it. In 2008, in New Jersey, 16,300 New Jersey citizens, many college aged, they cast rejected ballots provisionally, which served as voter registration forms for future elections. 16,300. That made up 22% of the total provisional ballots cast. So about a quarter of provisional ballots cast in the state were rejected, although they were counted for future elections as a form of voter registration. And there's a current effort right now for same-day registration, election day registration in New Jersey that I encourage you all to take a look at. Two organizations are really leading that charge, League of Women Voters of New Jersey and the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. Because while New Jersey rates were really good in 2020, they can be much higher because SDR has a specific impact.
Okay, so we have sadly reached the end of our time, and so, certainly the hallmark of Eagleton, the hallmark of this Darien Civic Engagement Project is to try to link the theory with the practice. The practice so far for you has been going out and registering voters and getting them out to vote. But I think we have another avenue that we can and should be pursuing, and really looking seriously at electoral law. And we're really grateful and fortunate to have had Professor Bromberg walk us through that process. So please join me in thanking her for joining us. Lucky enough to be here. There is pizza on the patio.